Lights. Camera.
Moteur. Ça tourne.
Action.
In 1992, Disneyland Paris opened in France under the name Euro Disneyland. Expecting the park to be a success among European guests, many of whom may have been unable to afford a trip to the United States to visit a Disney park, Disney staked a huge sum of its fortune in the new location, investing millions into the project, hiring and training thousands of local employees, and anticipating somewhere in the region of 500,000 visitors on opening day. So confident was Disney in the success of their new European venture that initial plans had already been drawn up for a second gate at Euro Disneyland, Disney MGM Studios Europe. The park was to be a sister park, read clone, of MGM Studios at Walt Disney World in Florida, which had opened 3 years earlier in 1989 and is now known as Hollywood Studios. The park would be themed as a movie studio consisting of backlots and sound stages that would give guests a behind-the-scenes look at the Disney movies they loved and finally bring the glamour of Hollywood to Europe. The original plans for MGM Studios borrowed heavily from its sister location, but with adjustments made for the European market. The park would be themed for old Hollywood glamour. Guests would first enter through Hollywood Boulevard, this time in a perpetual twilight, as the area would be entirely indoors as a shelter against Europe's cold and rainy winters. Then they would step outside to see a French version of the Chinese theatre, with its own great movie ride. Further into the park, guests would find attractions such as special effects shows, superstar television, and the Honey I Shrunk the Kids movie set adventure, as well as restaurants like the Sci-Fi Dine-In Theatre and the Brown Derby restaurant, many of which either already existed or would eventually find their way to Florida. Additionally, a major e-ticket attraction would be the unnamed Gangster Shootout Thrill Ride, perhaps a version of the Dick Tracy Crime Stoppers dark ride once planned for Florida. In many ways, the new park was set to be a more grandiose, definitive version of Florida's MGM, with a greater focus on the theme of movies as a whole rather than the movie-making process, and would capitalise on the European romanticism surrounding Americana, which was a big theme of all of Euro Disneyland. After all, to this day, every single one of the 7 Paris hotels has some sort of American theme. But at Euro Disneyland's opening day on April 12th, no one showed up. Well, okay, technically that's not true. People did show up, they were always going to, but just nowhere near as many as Disney or anyone else thought. The French government had estimated that as many as 90,000 cars would attempt to enter the resort, but by midday the parking was approximately half full. Beyond opening day, Euro Disneyland's fortunes continued to falter. By May, the park had reportedly lost 25% of its workforce through resignations over alleged poor working conditions. Attendance was only at 25,000 a day, compared to the estimated 60,000. Guests were spending less than predicted, and to make matters worse, French public opinion of Disney was bleak. Disney had been accused by many in the press of cultural imperialism, of trying to Americanize French culture, and by one French stage director of creating a cultural Chernobyl. Controversies were ignited over Disney's strict dress code being affront to personal liberties in France, and of managers supposedly requiring English to be spoken in all meetings. At one point, French farmers even blockaded the park as a protest against the American government's agricultural policies. As a result of all of this, Disney's stock price began to tumble, and less than a year after the opening of Euro Disneyland, the plans for the second gate were permanently shelved, while the resort attempted to save itself from bankruptcy and complete closure. However, in 1995, things finally started to turn around for Euro Disneyland, as several new attractions and a rebrand as Disneyland Paris saw the park finally make a profit. As a result, the second gate plans were drawn up once again, and so work got underway on the new park, with the MGM name dropped and now named Walt Disney Studios. But that's not the end of the story. Despite the upturn in Disney's fortunes, the company was still extremely hesitant and also simply unable to take as much of financial risk with Walt Disney Studios as they were with the original Paris park. The budget for Euro Disneyland's first park and hotel had sat at around $4.4 billion, but when work began on Walt Disney Studios, Disney was still in debt from their previous financial difficulty, and so a much more modest sum of $645 million was set to build the new park and hotels. This seriously limited the scale of the type of park Disney were able to build in comparison to Disneyland next door, and so the original plans for the Disney Studios had to be cut back dramatically. And so Disney was confronted with the problem that has plagued Walt Disney Studios since the very beginning: money. And it's for this reason that Walt Disney Studios was frankly doomed from the start. With the new, much smaller than expected budget for Walt Disney Studios come 1995, the original plans simply weren't feasible, and so drastic downsizing was needed to make the project affordable. For starters, the gangster shootout and great movie ride attractions were scrapped entirely, and the park was reduced to around half the size of its counterpart next door, making it still to this day the smallest Disney park in the world, not counting the water parks. The new version of the park was officially announced in 1999, and finally on March 16, 2002, Walt Disney Studios was officially open to the public, to an underwhelming reception. If you had been following the news at the opening of a second gate in Paris in the early 2000s, then I imagine entering Walt Disney Studios would have felt like something of a betrayal.
That's it? That's the last episode? That was just a bunch of cheap walk cycles!
This was not an ornate tribute to old Hollywood, but was instead a rushed park intended to create a boost in revenue as quickly as possible. Guests first enter into a plainly themed courtyard, where guest services and stroller rentals are located. Overlooking them is the Eiffel Tower, a remake of the one in Orlando. And while the entrance of a park is often the most plain part of it, things don't go up from here. Ahead of them lies Disney Studio One, the large soundstage that serves as this park's main street. But if you were expecting to enter Disney Studio One and find the glamorous Hollywood Boulevard basking in eternal twilight, you would be sorely disappointed to instead find a short walkway of two-dimensional building facades lit by visible studio lighting and a food court. If you looked up, you wouldn't see the stars and a faint glow of Los Angeles proper, but the blacked out rafters hanging from the ceiling of the building. For budgetary reasons, the design of Studio One had been changed from Hollywood Boulevard to simply a set of Hollywood Boulevard, with all the cheap shortcuts that entails. Upon emerging from Studio One, you enter Disney Brothers Plaza, what is effectively the hub of the park. But beyond it, you wouldn't find the Chinese theatre looming over you like in Hollywood Studios, but instead a basic pathway to the park's tram tour attraction. It was here that guests finally uncovered the full design of the park, an empty lot with a few sound stages, barely distinguishable from a general office building. In total, the park featured only 8 attractions on opening day. To the right of the plaza was Animation Courtyard, or maybe more appropriately, Animation Cul-de-sac, which featured 3 attractions. The Art of Disney Animation, a stage show where a cast member would play a Disney animator, teaching the audience about how Disney animation was made alongside the Dragon Mushu. Animagique, a live musical stage show featuring Mickey and Friends, and the Flying Carpets over Agrabah, the standard magic carpets of Aladdin prefab ride from Magic Kingdom, shipped over to Paris, but this time with a painted wall surrounding it, instead of any sort of decorative theming. To the left was Production Courtyard, which featured Cinemagique, the hybrid stage and screen show through the movies starring Martin Shaw, and the Studio Tram Tour, a heavily modified version of the tram tour from Hollywood Studios, which I'll delve into in more detail later. The last area of the park towards the rear was the backlot, which featured Rock and Roller Coaster starring Aerosmith, an almost identical version of the same indoor roller coaster from Hollywood Studios, Armageddon, the special effects, a high-intensity special effects show based on the 1998 movie Armageddon, and lastly, perhaps the biggest draw of the park, Motors Action Stunt Show Spectacular, a large-scale stunt show featuring live actors and stunt driving. Despite the presence of 3 e-ticket attractions, one of which was an entirely original concept developed for Walt Disney Studios, the park was severely lacking in quality. For starters, there were only 3 actual rides of any sort in the park: the Tram Tour, Rock and Roller Coaster, and the Flying Carpets. And 2 of these were rides that already existed elsewhere. Even California Adventure, which had opened the year before Walt Disney Studios and is infamous among Disney fans for being initially disastrous, had Soarin', California Screaming, and Grizzly River Runner opening. 3 original e-ticket attractions that are still popular today. The tram tour was the only ride that was actually unique to Walt Disney Studios, but only on a technicality. The ride was a Paris version of the tram tour that existed at Hollywood Studios, but because the tour is at least supposed to give the impression that this is a working studio, Disney couldn't just rebuild the tour in the exact same way as the original. That, and they probably couldn't afford to build it in the exact same way either, so the ride was significantly changed to fit the new park. The original pre-show, where guest volunteers participate in a mini special effects show themed after the movie Pearl Harbor, was removed entirely, partially for cost, but presumably also because of the difficulty of creating guest interaction shows when you can't be confident that enough of your guests will all speak the same language. Beyond the lost pre-show, the ride itself wasn't any less disappointing. And it's this attraction that I really think strikes at the core of what made Walt Disney Studios such a disaster on opening day. Once guests board the trams, they get to see 3 movie sets, including a clone of the Catastrophe Canyon scene from the Backlot tour in Hollywood Studios, a special effects area where a natural disaster causes a truck explosion in the American desert. The problem, however, was that unlike in Orlando, which originally did have some areas that, while few, were genuinely used to film movies, absolutely none of Paris's tram tour was authentic. It was simply a fake backlot presented to guests as if it were real. And what's more, none of the movies that Disney chose to focus on were even popular. The first set guests go past is the entrance to the city in Dinotopia. Not a movie, but a TV miniseries that aired as part of the Wonderful World of Disney in 2002. Disney included this set and numerous props from the show on the tour in the hopes that the show would achieve widespread success around the time the park opened. But instead, the complete opposite happened and the show bombed, leaving them with a set from a failed TV show permanently built in their theme park. And what's more, it wasn't even the real set. From what I can find online, the real show was filmed at Pinewood Studios in England, and this set is simply a recreation for the ride. Lights and camera equipment surrounding it are simply props to sell the idea that this is a movie set. The other set guests see is a much more lavish set of central London, decimated by a dragon attack for the 2002 movie Reign of Fire. Also an attempt by Disney to achieve some cross-promotion, and also a major disappointment. Remember Reign of Fire? No? Neither does anyone else, because this movie barely managed to make a return when it released. I always thought this part of the tour was really cool because I really like these sorts of sets, but that's besides the point. I also can't find any information that suggests that this set is anything other than a recreation. There's potential that this could be the original set torn down and shipped to Paris, but from what I can tell, the movie was filmed between England and Ireland, not at Walt Disney Studios. The rest of the tram tour was filled with a random assortment of props from various Disney movies. Most of them were from the same 2 or 3 films that had come out around the time the park opened, and they really gave the impression that they were just junk Disney had managed to source for cheap to pad out a bland attraction that was basically just serving as a dumping ground for them. Some of the props were from successful movies at the time, like Pearl Harbor and 102 Dalmatians, but others were clearly pieces of junk that just needed a place to live. In fact, Disney was so low on props for the backlot that some of what they used were not actually movie props at all. If you're a hardcore Disney Parks fan, you might be interested to know that one of the props included was actually the hovercraft from the much loved Epcot attraction Horizons, which had closed permanently 3 years earlier. The saving grace of Walt Disney Studios was Motors Action's Stunt Show Spectacular, a 40-minute stunt show in the backlot area of the park, where guests watch several action sequences being filmed for an upcoming movie set in a village in the south of France. The sequences predominantly feature car chases, but also involve jet skis, pyrotechnics, and physical stunts. The show was largely well received, and successful enough on its own that a monolingual English language version eventually opened 3 years later at Hollywood Studios as Lights Motors Action Extreme Stunt Show. Both of these shows lasted over a decade, with Lights Motors Action closing in 2016 to make way for Galaxy's Edge, and Motors Action lasting 18 years, closing in 2020. The show was an original concept for Walt Disney Studios, appropriately themed for the country it was in, and featured genuinely impressive stunt driving. But even so, the severe lack of any killer attractions, combined with a frankly half-hearted attempt at theming the park, made for a shockingly bad overall image for Walt Disney Studios. Disney Studio 1 is perhaps the best example of how Disney dropped the ball with this park. The initial idea for a Twilight Hollywood Boulevard to serve as the all-important first impression, and then the continuous scaling back of that concept until you end up with a tacky, two-dimensional facsimile that only looks slightly better than a shopping mall, is the perfect image for the shambles that was Walt Disney Studios. Even many at Disney felt this way. In the Imagineering Story documentary on Disney+, Disney Imagineer Bruce Vaughan recalls entering Walt Disney Studios for the first time and asking, "When are we going to get to the park?" before being told, "You're in the park." And if you've ever visited Walt Disney Studios yourself, you can probably understand why he felt that way. The design of Courtyard, Main Street, Courtyard feels like an attempt to artificially extend the size of the park and hide the fact that it's so barren, rather than any sort of way to present theming to guests. In many ways, it seemed like the movie studio theme was mostly just an excuse for Disney to cut corners in their theming. Overall, the feeling that Walt Disney Studios gave could be explained in one word: cheap. The park felt like it had been rushed and made for cheap as a budget MGM Studios, with a fake backlot and fake sound stages and a few prefab rides and a whole load of quick and easy stage shows to reach the bare minimum requirement for a theme park. And that's because in a way it had been. With barely a little over a quarter of the budget of its neighbour Disneyland Park, Walt Disney Studios didn't cut corners out of laziness. It cut corners because it had to, and now Disney had to deal with the consequences. This problem was also exacerbated by the fact that Disneyland Park is often regarded by many as being the most beautiful Disney park in the world, with the charm of Disneyland in Anaheim and the scale of Magic Kingdom in Orlando, which only further served to highlight the ugliness of Walt Disney Studios. The movies that were included in the park were never major draws to begin with, and as time went on, they only served more and more to prove how unappealing the place was. Just like Disney Imagineers, guests were equally unimpressed with the flat and lifeless park meant to save Disneyland Paris. Attendance to the park was a fraction of attendance to Disneyland Park. In 2006, attendance to Disneyland Park sat around 10 million, while attendance to Walt Disney Studios that year sat around 2 million. In the years following its opening, Walt Disney Studios was quickly shaping up to be Disney's worst theme park ever. But as Disneyland Paris's finances recovered, Disney didn't give up on the park, and attempts were made to reinvigorate it and slowly turn it into what it was always supposed to be, with varying levels of success. In 2007, the first major expansion to turn around the negative image of Walt Disney Studios was opened. Animation Courtyard was renamed Toon Studio, a spin-off idea of the Toontown areas of Disneyland and Magic Kingdom. 2 new attractions were added. One of these was Cars Race Rally, a family-oriented flat ride based on the movie Cars, and the other was a new, original e-ticket attraction named Crush's Coaster, a spinning indoor roller coaster based on Finding Nemo, and opened in the same year as Epcot's The Seas with Nemo and Friends, and the same day as Finding Nemo's Submarine Voyage at Disneyland. 2007 really was the year of Nemo. Crush's Coaster was very well received and a much needed update to the park, but still not enough to carry the park on its own. And so later that same year, the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror was opened in Production Courtyard. This version of Tower of Terror was very similar, although not identical, to the California Adventure version of the attraction, as that park's version was originally planned for Walt Disney Studios several years earlier. As a result, it doesn't include the fourth dimension scene that exists in the Hollywood Studios version of the ride, which in my opinion makes the Paris version an inferior Tower of Terror, but was still a welcome addition to the park regardless. In 2019, this ride received a refresh called Tower of Terror: A New Dimension of Chills, which updated the storyline and some of the special effects. In 2010, yet another expansion was brought to the park. Toy Story Playland was a small, family-friendly area of the park with 3 attractions: Toy Soldiers Parachute Drop, Slinky Dog Zigzag Spin, and RC Racer. All off-the-shelf, cheap solutions to pad out the things to do at the park. But the problem Walt Disney Studios had still remained. Despite 3 expansions being brought to the park in the span of 8 years, there still wasn't all that much to do. When you combined the low attendance with the limited number of attractions that were actually worth it, the average guest could do everything they wanted by early to mid-afternoon, leading Walt Disney Studios to be thought of as something no theme park wants to be referred to as: the dreaded half-day park. And so in 2014, the most major addition to Walt Disney Studios was opened, and it still remains the park's crowning glory. Remy's Ratatouille adventure opened in the Toon Studio area of the park, now renamed to Worlds of Pixar, and was an indoor dark ride that incorporated cutting-edge trackless ride technology alongside 3D screens similar to that of the Amazing Adventures of Spider-Man at Universal's Islands of Adventure, to shrink guests down to the size of a rat on a trip through Gusteau's restaurant from the movie Ratatouille. The ride was one of the largest additions to not just the park, but the whole of Disneyland Paris, costing an estimated $270 million. That's almost half of what the whole park initially cost to build. The ride itself is honestly pretty fantastic, and has to be to this day the most intricately designed area of the park. It looks much less like a flat soundstage area, and more like the France Pavilion at Epcot. In fact, in 2021, Remy's Ratatouille Adventure was brought to Epcot's France as a result of its success. A table service restaurant called Remy's Bistro opened in the same show building, and the whole area of the park took major steps in salvaging Walt Disney Studios from the worst park label. The final addition to date to Walt Disney Studios was the Avengers Campus, which opened in 2022. Similar to the version that opened in California Adventure the year earlier, it was a reskin of a large part of the backlot area of the park, making a firm move away from the park's theming as a movie studio towards a similar step Hollywood Studios had taken as being themed after the world of the movies. Avengers Campus brought with it two new attractions. Spider-Man Web Adventure was an interactive dark ride similar to Toy Story Midway Mania, where guests donned 3D glasses to shoot Spider-Man webs at targets on screens, and replaced the Armageddon special effects show. And Avengers Assemble Flight Force, which was a reskin of Rock 'n' Roller Coaster starring Aerosmith, changing the theme of the coaster to a flight through space on a mission with Marvel's Avengers. Since opening in 2002, Walt Disney Studios has seen many changes that have drastically improved the park. After 20 years of salvage projects, Walt Disney Studios had become a worthy second gate, although still definitely a second gate. I do think Walt Disney Studios is still the worst park Disney has to offer, but I don't think that statement is as damning as it once was. My last visit was in 2017, after Remy's Ratatouille Adventure opened, but before the Avengers Campus. And while I did think that the new additions made the park leagues better than it once was, I still saw it as a park of two halves. One made up of the newer, higher quality attractions, and one with the older opening day stuff decaying and aging alongside it. I guess that's the way things go with theme parks. Things take so long to build and replace that you're often left with no choice but to let outdated stuff sit around long past its expiry date. The tram tour was still operating in the park all the way up to January 2020, and if it seemed old and uninteresting in 2002, then 18 years later it was much, much worse. As time went on, the props on display became more and more dated, and nothing new was added to take their place. It had become incredibly apparent that this was simply a ride that was made for the park's opening and then just left there. The ride was replaced in 2020 by Cars Road Trip, to coincide with the ever-expanding Pixar-themed area of the park. But this attraction may well be a contender for cheapest cop-out in Disney history. The new attraction was simply a reskin of the tram tour, removing the Hollywood backlot theme and replacing it with a tour through the world of Cars, where guests would see a handful of barren, static scenes, and the old Catastrophe Canyon, now with a Dynaco truck to fit the new theme. To anyone that's been following the news of the future of Walt Disney Studios, however, it's obvious that the reskin is only intended to be temporary. In 2019, Disney announced the most major expansion project to Walt Disney Studios they have ever done. A massive €2 billion project to overhaul the park and finally put the studio theme to rest. The remaining areas of the backlot are to be replaced with 3 new areas. The first was the now open Avengers Campus. Motors Action, which closed in 2020, is to eventually be replaced by a Paris version of Galaxy's Edge, the Star Wars themed land from Hollywood Studios and Disneyland, and will include a version of Millennium Falcon's Smuggler's Run. The remainder of the backlot will be replaced by a lagoon, and on the other side of it, Arendelle, a Frozen themed land complete with a castle, and the boat ride Frozen Ever After, that replaced Epcot's Maelstrom in 2016. With the upcoming expansions, the future of Walt Disney Studios finally looks bright. And the expectation among Disney fans is that perhaps more than 20 years after opening, Walt Disney Studios can shed its negative reputation and become the theme park it was always supposed to be. There are a lot of changes that still need to be made, and the success of the new expansion remains to be seen. The first part of the expansion, the Avengers Campus, was not hugely well received at either Paris or California Adventure, and it seems likely that whatever version of Galaxy's Edge is built in Paris will be a scaled down version of the original. Disney Studio 1 is still desperately in need of a revamp, and some attractions like the flying carpets with their ugly matte painting backdrop need changing or removing entirely. That being said, I do feel hopeful for the future of Walt Disney Studios. I think that to an extent there is only so much that you can do to change a park once it's been built, and its disastrous history will likely affect it for decades to come. But maybe sometime in the near future, Walt Disney Studios will once and for all stop being Disney's worst park. Thanks so much for watching this video. This is by far the longest video I've ever made for this channel because there's just so much I want to say about Walt Disney Studios. These videos take a ton of time, so if you liked it, I would very much appreciate if you subscribed. Apart from that, if there's anything else you'd like me to cover in the future, please let me know, and I'll see you next time.